Chapter 1. The Comfortable Unknown. For most of his adult life, Richard Evers had believed that trouble announced itself loudly. It arrived with shouting or slammed doors or sudden absences. Drama left fingerprints. You knew when something was wrong because it demanded your attention. What Rich had not accounted for was the quiet variety. The kind that slipped in during otherwise good days and made itself at home without changing the furniture. He was 33 years old, married for 4 years, gainfully employed, and by all visible measures content. His job in systems analytics at a data storage company was steady, analytical in a way that soothed him. Problems had solutions. Systems either worked or they didn't, and when they didn't, there was usually a log somewhere that explained why. Some nights ran late, but most evenings, he walked through the door just after 6 to the smell of dinner or the sound of Emily humming to herself in the kitchen. Emily, his wife, 6 years together. For married. She was the quiet rhythm in his life, the one who remembered birthdays, who organized cupboards by some internal logic only she understood, who stole the blanket no matter how wide the bed was. Their life wasn't thrilling, but it wasn't stale either. It was built of routines they chose deliberately. Phones stayed off during dinner. Work talk was capped at 15 minutes. Evenings were for catching up, or arguing lightly about movies, or sitting on opposite ends of the couch with intertwined feet and separate books. They had talked about kids, not urgently but honestly. They had agreed on a window. Rich wasn't in a rush, but he also didn't want to be helping with algebra homework while shopping for reading glasses. Emily laughed when he said that, told him he was catastrophizing. Life hummed comfortably, until it didn't. It started innocently enough. A buzz on the table while they were eating. Emily would glance at her phone, frown slightly, then flip it face down. Work? Rich would ask casually. Yeah, she'd say, just as casual. At first, it happened once or twice a week. Then more often. Then later. Rich noticed patterns for a living. He noticed when those texts stopped being spaced days apart and started clustering. When they came during their shows instead of before dinner. When Emily began excusing herself to answer them instead of laughing them off. He told himself it was temporary. Projects ramped up. Offices got weird near deadlines. He didn't want to be the husband who counted notifications. But one night, lying in bed with the lights out, mid-conversation about nothing in particular, her phone chimed. Emily reached for it immediately. Rich glanced at the clock on his nightstand. 10:58 p.m. She read the screen, smiled just briefly, but with a kind of reflexive warmth and typed. Who's texting so late? Rich asked, keeping his tone neutral. Just work stuff, Emily said. Her thumbs kept moving. Sorry. She finished typing, set the phone down, leaned over, and kissed him. Soft, familiar. Night, she murmured. He lay awake longer than usual after that. Because it wasn't the text, it was the smile. Over the next month, the late-night messages became routine. Rich didn't confront her outright. He wasn't sure what he'd say without sounding accusatory, and part of him, an unfairly optimistic part, believed that if nothing physical was happening, then it didn't merit disruption. But discomfort doesn't shrink when ignored. Calcified. The quarterly luncheon came on a Thursday. Emily's company hosted it at a mid-range event space downtown. Round tables, linen napkins, bland protein options. Rich agreed to go because spouses were encouraged, and because some small, stubborn part of him wanted context. Faces to attach to names. They arrived early and found their assigned table. 8 seats. Name cards. Emily greeted co-workers silly, clearly comfortable. Rich found himself shaking hands, offering polite smiles, filing away impressions. Then she said, "Oh, Rich, this is Kevin." Kevin stood to greet him, all confident posture and polished grin. He was tall, well-dressed, and entirely too comfortable placing a hand on Emily's chair as he spoke to her. "So you're the husband," Kevin said, smiling as though it were an inside joke. "That's me," Rich replied evenly. It didn't take long for Kevin to start orbiting Emily, leaning in, speaking quietly, positioning himself just close enough to discourage interruption. Emily didn't pull away. She laughed. She engaged. Rich felt something settle behind his ribs, heavy and unwelcome. He turned instead to the woman seated beside him, Emily's manager. Her name card read Sylvia Reynolds. She was in her 50s, silver hair pulled back neatly, expression warm but observant. They exchanged pleasantries, talked generally about work cultures. Eventually, Rich asked, carefully, "Can I ask you something that might be out of line?" Sylvia tilted her head. "Try me. Does your company expect people to continue work conversations after hours? Late at night?" She looked genuinely puzzled. "No," she said. "Absolutely not." "Why?" Rich explained without embellishment. "The late nights, the volume, the frequency." Sylvia's eyes flicked briefly toward Emily and Kevin before returning to Rich. Her voice lowered. "If they're talking," she said quietly, "it isn't about work." The honesty in her tone was unvarnished. Rich thanked her. He sat back in his chair and stared at the tablecloth for a moment, breathing slowly. Then he stood. Emily was mid-sentence when he interrupted. "Kevin?" Rich said calmly. Are you married? The table fell silent. Kevin blinked, caught off guard. No, he said with a chuckle. Haven't found the one yet. Rich nodded as if that made perfect sense. Then he smiled. There was no warmth in it. So why? Rich asked, voice steady. Is a single man spending so much time texting my wife late at night? Are you interviewing her for the position? Emily gasped. Kevin sputtered. Man, it's not. Rich raised a hand. Stop. He looked Kevin dead in the eye. The next time you text my wife, Rich said evenly, I will come to your home and we will have a very serious private conversation about boundaries. No one spoke. Rich turned to Sylvia. Thank you for the invitation. He took his jacket, placed a hand briefly on Emily's chair, an old habit, now instinct without affection, and walked out. Emily remained seated, surrounded by linen, witnesses, and the sudden collapse of her half-truths. And for the first time in years, their life was no longer predictable. It was about to change. Chapter 2. Silence is loud. Rich didn't remember driving away from the luncheon. Only the sensation of motion and the dull awareness that traffic still existed, even when your life cracked down the center. At some point, he realized his hands were tight on the wheel, his shoulders locked high, his jaw aching from being clenched too long. He exhaled deliberately and loosened his grip. He didn't speed. He didn't blast music. He just drove. When he pulled into their driveway, the house looked exactly as it always did. Porch light on, curtains drawn. Nothing to suggest that anything inside had shifted. It irritated him more than if the windows had been smashed. He went inside, set his keys on the hook by the door, then immediately took them back. He stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the quiet. Emily wouldn't be home for a while. He knew that. He wondered what it was like to sit at that table after someone detonated a truth bomb and walked away. He went upstairs, opened his suitcase, the one they used for weekend trips, and packed without ceremony. A change of clothes, toiletries, his laptop. He paused at the dresser, fingers hovering over the framed photo of them from a friend's wedding last year. Emily was laughing in it mid-moment, unaware of the camera. He left it where it was. Rich drove to his brother Mark's house on autopilot. Mark answered the door in socks and a t-shirt, eyebrows lifting in surprise. Everything okay? Can I crash here tonight? Rich asked. Mark stepped aside immediately. Yeah, of course. What happened? Later, Rich said. If that's all right. Mark didn't push. The guest room smelled faintly of laundry detergent and neutrality. Rich sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his phone until the screen dimmed. No messages. He wasn't sure what he expected. When the light went out, sleep didn't arrive. His thoughts looped. Emily's smile at the phone. Kevin's hand on her chair. Sylvia's quiet certainty. The sound of his own voice when he said boundaries like it was a word he'd practiced for years. He woke before his alarm, groggy and unresolved. Emily didn't come home to an empty house until nearly 2 hours after Rich left the luncheon. The drive back was agony. Every red light felt accusatory, every mile a countdown. Kevin had tried to speak to her after Rich walked out, had leaned close and murmured something about damage control, but she brushed past him with shaking hands and eyes that refused to settle. Now she unlocked the front door and stepped into a silence so complete it pressed against her chest. Rich? She called automatically, already knowing the answer. She set her purse down, then picked it up again, aimless. His shoes were gone. The guest toothbrush was untouched. No note. Her phone buzzed. Kevin. She stared at the screen, while rising fast, and turned the phone face down. Emily sat at the kitchen table, the same one where they ate dinner most nights, phones away, legs brushing underneath. She put her elbows down, lowered her head into her hands, and breathed through the rush of shame. She replayed the scene over and over, each time finding a new moment she wished she had handled differently. When Rich asked who was texting that first night, she could have been honest. When the messages became more personal, she could have shut it down. When Kevin started to assume familiarity that wasn't his to assume, she could have drawn a line. But she hadn't. Not because she wanted to cheat, because it felt good to be wanted without expectation. That truth landed heavier than anything Rich had said aloud. Emily hadn't felt neglected, exactly. Rich was present, kind, predictable in a way she once found comforting. But the last year had been demanding at work, and Kevin noticed when she stayed late. He noticed when her ideas landed well in meetings. He noticed her, in a way that was easy because it required nothing else of her. She had told herself it was harmless because she never crossed the line. Now she wasn't sure where the line actually was. Rich went into work the next morning like nothing had happened. That, more than anything, unsettled his coworkers. He answered emails, ran reports, clarified a data discrepancy for a junior analyst. Around noon, his manager stopped by his desk. "You good?" she asked carefully. "Yeah," Rich said. Then, after a beat, "Personal stuff." She nodded and didn't pry. At lunch, he scrolled through his phone again. Still nothing. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or insulted. Mark texted him around 3. "Mark, you alive?" "Rich? Unfortunately." "Mark, you want to talk tonight?" Rich stared at the screen, then typed. "Rich, yeah." Fear helps honesty. Emily went to work and avoided Kevin with the precision of someone who researches escape routes. She took alternate paths between departments, kept her headphones on, answered only emails that required replies. By mid-afternoon, she was exhausted from the effort of ignoring one person. He caught her by the copier. "Hey," he said quietly. "About yesterday." "Don't," Emily said too quickly. She looked up, eyes hard. "We are not having this conversation." Kevin's confidence wavered. "I didn't think he'd react like that." "My husband," Emily said evenly, "reacted to you crossing a boundary, one I should have enforced." Kevin scoffed softly. "You didn't seem uncomfortable." Emily inhaled, steadying herself. "That's not permission." There was a pause. Kevin laughed, trying to recover ground. "You're overthinking it." "No," Emily said. "I was underthinking it. That's over." She walked away before he could respond. Heart pounding, legs unsteady, but upright. That evening, Rich and Mark sat on opposite sides of the patio table, bottles sweating in the late spring air. Mark waited until Rich spoke. "She lied," Rich said finally. "Not about sleeping with him, but about why they were talking." Mark nodded slowly. "That kind hurts its own way. I don't want to police my wife," Rich continued. "I don't want to wonder if I'm being compared to someone else every time her phone lights up. So what do you want?" Rich stared into the bottle. "I want to know if I'm still her priority, or if I'm just the dependable option." Emily came home to the house that night, changed, and sat on the edge of their bed for a long time. She finally picked up her phone and typed a message to Rich. Deleted it. Tried again. "Emily, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix it, but I need to talk to you." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Her chest tightened. A minute later, Rich, "Tomorrow. Not tonight." Emily typed okay and set the phone down, tears finally breaking through. Silence, she realized, wasn't passive. It was a boundary too. Chapter 3. Lines, drawn in ink. By Monday morning, the story had already begun to fossilize. Emily felt it in the glances that lingered half a second too long, in the way conversations softened when she approached and snapped back into place when she left. Offices, she'd learned, didn't need facts to form opinions, just a vacuum and a handful of assumptions. She focused on her screen, answering emails with surgical politeness. She kept her posture straight, her expression neutral. Her phone stayed face down, silent by design. When Kevin finally appeared beside her cubicle, she didn't look surprised. "Can we talk?" he asked, pitching his voice low. "No," Emily said immediately, and then clarified because clarity mattered now. "But I can tell you something." He waited, jaw tightening slightly, as though he were indulging her. "You crossed a boundary," Emily said. "More than one. I let it happen, and that part is mine. But this stops here. Do not message me. Do not linger by my desk. If you do, I'll document it." Kevin laughed once, incredulous. "You're really going to escalate this?" "I already have," Emily said. Internally, that landed harder than she expected. She watched it register, the calculation behind his eyes, the sudden awareness that recklessness had consequences. "Wow," he muttered. "Your husband really? Do not make this about him." Emily cut in. "This is about me choosing my marriage." She turned back to her screen. Kevin stood there a moment longer, clearly unused to being dismissed, before stalking away. Her hands shook for a few minutes afterward. But underneath the adrenaline was something steadier. Relief, maybe, or the simple comfort of alignment, of finally behaving in a way that matched the life she said she wanted. Rich spent his Monday morning rewriting a model he already knew worked. There was nothing wrong with the data. He knew that. But the act of revisiting it, checking assumptions, narrowing parameters, gave him something to do with his hands while his thoughts refused to cooperate. Around 10, Sylvia Reynolds appeared by his desk. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. Rich blinked, surprised. "Sure." Her office smelled faintly of citrus and paper. She gestured for him to sit, then closed the door. Not conspiratorially, just deliberately. "I wanted to check in," she said. "About Thursday." Rich nodded once. "I appreciate the honesty. Truly." "I'm not in the habit of lying," Sylvia said dryly, then softened. "For what it's worth, I spoke to your wife briefly this morning. Strictly professional. She seemed steady." That surprised him. He hadn't expected an update, and part of him bristled at receiving one. "I don't want you worrying that this will bleed into her work standing," Sylvia continued. "She's capable. That hasn't changed." He exhaled. "Thank you." Sylvia folded her hands. Marriages survive worse things than blurred boundaries. They don't survive denial. Rich looked down at his shoes, then back up. "I don't want to be someone who dramatizes suspicion." "Then don't," she said simply. "Be someone who insists on respect." He nodded slowly, the words settling. That had always been his line. Not jealousy, not control. Respect. That evening, Rich came home. Emily heard his key in the lock and stood so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. She hesitated in the kitchen doorway, heart thudding, when he appeared. They stared at each other for a moment, an entire weekend compressed between them. "Hi," she said finally. "Hi," Rich replied. He set his bag down. Didn't hug her. Didn't look away either. "I talked to Kevin," Emily said without preamble. "It's done. I told him to stop completely. I documented it." Rich nodded. That mattered. Not as proof but as posture. "Okay," he said. "Just that. I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't want to disappoint you," Emily continued, words rushing now that the dam had cracked. "And then I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd think I was already gone." Rich leaned against the counter. "I didn't think you cheated," he said quietly. "I thought you were lying to avoid a choice." Emily swallowed. "I was." Silence stretched, but it didn't feel hostile. Just full. "I need time," Rich said eventually. "Not distance. Time." She nodded immediately. "I can give you that. What I can't give," he added, "is another version of this." "I know," Emily said. "I don't want it either." For the first time since the luncheon, he reached for her. Just her hand, tentative but deliberate. "That's a start," he said. Emily squeezed back, tears burning but held in check. 2 nights later, Rich sat across from Mark again, this time with clearer eyes and less beer. "She didn't cheat," Rich said, "but she checked out in a way." Mark nodded. "Validation's a hell of a drug." "I don't want to win her back from someone else," Rich added. "I want us to choose each other deliberately." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Have you told her that?" "I told her I need time." Mark smiled faintly. "That's a man discovering he's allowed to have boundaries." Rich snorted. "Took me long enough." Emily scheduled a therapy consultation on Thursday. She didn't frame it as a fix, just an acknowledgement that she didn't trust her own blind spots right now. She left the confirmation email unread but starred, a small symbolic promise to herself. That night, she cooked Rich's favorite meal and didn't push conversation beyond the weather and a show they half-watched together. When he eventually leaned over and rested his head against her shoulder, she didn't mistake it for forgiveness. It was something else. Permission to keep going. The lines were drawn now, not in the sand but in ink, visible, intentional, and impossible to ignore. And for the first time since everything fractured, both of them knew where they stood. Chapter 4. Apologies don't land unless they're heard. The therapist's waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon disinfectant. Rich noticed because noticing things gave him something to do besides react. Emily sat beside him on the small couch, hands folded in her lap, posture careful. Not stiff exactly, intentional. Like someone handling a fragile object without knowing where the cracks were. She hadn't tried to fill the quiet with small talk, and he appreciated that more than he expected. A door opened. "Richard and Emily Evers?" Rich stood first. Emily followed, smoothing her skirt unnecessarily. Dr. Hannah Lewis was younger than Rich expected, somewhere in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a voice that suggested both patience and a limit. Her office was softly lit but uncluttered. 2 chairs angled toward a couch, a low table with a box of tissues that seemed almost ceremonial. "Take whichever seats you like," Dr. Lewis said. Rich chose a chair. Emily chose the couch. Not a deliberate statement, he suspected, just inertia, but it didn't go unnoticed. "So," Dr. Lewis began once they were settled, "who wants to start?" Emily inhaled, then looked at Rich. He watched her consider, then speak. "I broke trust without breaking vows," she said. "And I need help understanding how that happened." Dr. Lewis nodded once, noting the phrasing. "And you, Rich?" He leaned back slightly. "I found out I was being lied to, and I reacted loudly because I didn't want to react slowly." That earned a faint smile from the therapist. Efficient, but not always gentle. "No," Rich agreed, "but honest." Emily's hands tightened. "I'm not asking him to undo it," she said quickly. "I'm asking him to believe that I see what I did." Dr. Lewis held up a hand, not to interrupt, but to pause. "Let's talk less about what each of you wants from the other, and more about what each of you is afraid of." The question landed heavily. Rich stared at the floor for a moment. "I'm afraid," he said finally, "that I'll wake up one day and realize my marriage became optional for my wife before it became inconvenient." Emily's breath caught. She didn't look away. "I'm afraid," she said, voice shaking but sure, "that I'll always need external validation to feel like I'm enough, and that eventually, I'll justify that need at the expense of what matters most." Silence followed, but it was the productive kind. The kind that meant something had shifted. Dr. Lewis nodded slowly. "Those are not incompatible fears," she said, "but they require different solutions than apologies." After the session, they walked side by side to the parking lot, emotions buzzing beneath the surface like faulty wiring. "I'm glad we went," Emily said softly. Rich nodded. "Me too." They reached their cars and hesitated. "This doesn't mean everything's fixed," he added. "I know," she said. "It means we started on the right problem." That night, they ate dinner together without the television on, something that had quietly fallen away over the years without either of them noticing. Conversation came in stops and starts. Mundane observations, shared irritation at the thermostat, but it was real. Afterward, Rich cleared the plates automatically while Emily dried, their movements still synchronized despite the tension. I don't expect you to forgive me quickly, Emily said as she handed him a dish. I'm not measuring time, Rich replied. I'm measuring consistency. She nodded. That's fair. He hesitated, then added, you don't need to earn me by suffering. She looked at him sharply. That's not what I know, he said. I'm just saying. I need effort, not self-punishment. Emily exhaled shakily. That might be harder. He almost smiled. Over the next 2 weeks, small things accumulated. Emily stopped bringing her phone to the table entirely. Not as a show, just a habit changed deliberately. When Kevin was mentioned in an office email thread, she forwarded casually for transparency, without commentary. Rich noticed. He didn't comment every time. He let the weight shift naturally. He, in turn, stopped withdrawing into logic when feelings spilled into inconvenient moments. When he felt resentment flare, at a text notification from anyone, at a remembered laugh, he named it instead of swallowing it whole. This feels raw, he said once. Not bad, just tender. Emily took that in without defensiveness. Thank you for telling me. They laughed again, too. Once, when Emily accidentally burned dinner, Rich deadpanned, is this part of your rebuilding trust strategy? She threw a towel at him, startled into laughter, and for a moment the house felt like home again instead of neutral territory. Another therapy session followed, then another. Dr. Lewis didn't let either of them stay comfortable for long. What needs weren't being voiced? She asked them. Emily answered without deflecting. I wanted admiration without responsibility. Rich answered too. I assumed consistency made me immune to being taken for granted. Dr. Lewis nodded. Marriage doesn't erode because love disappears. It erodes because attention gets outsourced. That one stuck with them both. One evening, a month after the luncheon, Emily came home and found Rich sitting at the kitchen table. Not working, not distracted, just there. Can we talk? He asked. Her stomach tightened. Yes. I'm not angry anymore, he said. But I'm still cautious. That's new for me. She didn't rush to fix it. I don't need you to be fearless. I need you to be honest. I am, he said. Here's the honesty. I want us to date again. Intentionally. No autopilot. Her eyes softened. I'd like that. And if this ever starts to feel like an audition, I'll stop, Emily said immediately. We'll talk. I won't hide. Rich nodded. Good. Because I won't compete. They went out the following Friday, not extravagantly. Just dinner downtown and a walk afterward. But it felt different. Purposeful. At one point, Emily reached for his hand, then paused. Is this okay? Rich took it himself. You don't have to ask forever, he said. Just for now. She squeezed once, grateful for the clarity. Apologies Rich was learning weren't currency. They were acknowledgments. What rebuilt trust wasn't regret. It was presence. Again, and again, and again. And for the first time since everything broke open, the effort felt mutual instead of performative. They weren't fixed, but they were moving, together, eyes open, lines respected. Not back to what they were, but forward into something more deliberate. Something chosen. Chapter 5. Truth is inconvenient. The third therapy session felt different before it even began. Rich noticed it as soon as he sat down. No tightness in his chest, no cataloging of exits. Emily noticed it when she realized she wasn't rehearsing what she planned to say. They were still cautious, but the caution no longer carried panic. It was steadier now. Deliberate. Dr. Lewis clasped her notebook closed and looked at them both. Last time we talked about attention being outsourced, she said. Today, I'd like to talk about entitlement. Emily stiffened slightly. Rich tilted his head. Intrigued. Not accusation, the therapist added calmly. Assumption. She turned first to Rich. What did you assume your role in this marriage guaranteed you? Rich frowned, not defensively, but thoughtfully. Loyalty, he said after a moment. Not in the sense that Emily would never be tempted, but that if something crossed from professional into personal, she'd tell me. That I'd be looped in before I was blindsided. Dr. Lewis nodded. And when that didn't happen, I felt replaceable, Rich said quietly. Like my consistency made me background noise. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Dr. Lewis turned to her. What did you assume you were entitled to? Emily didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was level but raw. Feeling interesting without effort. Rich looked at her. Not sharply but clearly. I didn't think of it that way at the time, Emily continued. But Kevin didn't need anything from me. No shared bills. No compromises. Just attention. And I let myself believe I could take that without cost. Dr. Lewis let the silence work. Truth, she finally said, is inconvenient because it doesn't arrange itself kindly around our self-image. Emily nodded, swallowing. I don't like who I was becoming. Rich shifted forward. I don't like that I didn't notice sooner. Dr. Lewis raised an eyebrow. Why do you think you should have? Rich paused. Because I pride myself on reading systems, patterns, and I missed this. That's professional identity bleeding into personal expectation, she said gently. Your wife isn't a dataset. I know, Rich said. But part of me still feels like I failed a basic diagnostic. Emily looked at him then really looked. You're not responsible for my silence, she said. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't apologetic. It was factual. That mattered more than the words themselves. Later that evening, they walked home from dinner downtown, the city softened by early summer warmth. Emily held her jacket over her arm, gesturing as she talked. I keep thinking about something Dr. Lewis said, she said. About entitlement. Yeah. I think I felt entitled to relief, Emily said. Work was hard. I didn't tell you how hard because I didn't want to bring it home. And then someone else noticed without me having to ask. Rich nodded slowly. I thought I was being supportive by not pushing you to vent. Emily laughed weakly. Turns out silence is slippery. They crossed at the light, steps in sync. Here's my inconvenient truth, Rich said after a moment. I liked being relied on. Liked that you had your world and I had mine. And they overlapped neatly. Emily smiled faintly. Neat wasn't the same as close. No, he agreed. It was easier, though. She bumped his arm lightly. You're still allowed to like ease. I don't want ease that costs intimacy, he said. She stopped walking then, turning to face him fully. Neither do I. It was a small moment. No raised voices, no dramatics. But something settled between them. Naming the trade-off made it easier to reject. The test came sooner than either of them expected. Emily was at work when an unfamiliar number lit up her phone. She didn't answer it. A text followed. Kevin, didn't think I'd have to use a new number. Can we talk? Just 5 minutes. Her stomach dropped, not with longing but irritation. She forwarded the message to Rich without commentary. Then she walked straight to HR. It wasn't a grand confrontation. No shouting. Just paperwork, documentation, a clear timeline. Kevin was asked to relocate teams pending review. Emily went home that night exhausted in a way that felt earned. Rich was at the table when she arrived, takeout containers already opened. Hey, he said. Hey, she set her bag down. I forwarded you something. I saw, Rich replied. How are you? Tired, Emily said honestly. But lighter, he nodded. I appreciate you looping me in. She hesitated. I didn't do it for validation. I know, he said. That's why it matters. They sat down to eat, silence easy. After a few bites, Rich said quietly, Old me would have wanted to confront him myself. Emily smiled slightly. New you. New me wants boring resolutions, he said. The kind that don't haunt us later. She reached across the table without asking. This time, he didn't hesitate. Over the following weeks, they discovered new discomforts, quieter, more persistent ones. Dating again meant confronting habits they'd both grown used to. Emily realized how often she defaulted to logistics when she felt emotionally exposed. Rich realized how quickly he defaulted to humor when he felt vulnerable. Neither instinct was wrong. Neither was sufficient. One night, curled up on opposite ends of the couch, Emily asked, Do you ever worry this will happen again? Rich didn't answer right away. Then, I worry less now because I don't feel in the dark. She nodded. I worry because now I know I'm capable of lying to myself. That's awareness, Rich said. Not a curse. Emily smiled faintly. Spoken like someone who likes data. He shrugged. Patterns exist whether we chart them or not. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Stay curious then. I plan to, he said. About you. About us. At their next therapy session, Dr. Lewis smiled when they sat down closer than before. What's changed? She asked. Emily spoke first. We stopped trying to be the version of us that looked easiest. Rich added, and started being honest about what feels expensive. Dr. Lewis nodded approvingly. Good. Because love doesn't fail because people stop caring. It fails when people stop telling the truth because it costs too much in the moment. As they stood to leave, Emily felt something unfamiliar and welcome. A cautious confidence. Their marriage wasn't repaired by grand gestures or dramatic ultimatums. It was being rebuilt by small, deliberate truths that refused to make themselves comfortable. And inconvenient as they were, those truths were finally pulling them in the same direction. Chapter 6. Relearning each other, they started dating each other on a Tuesday. Not intentionally. Not with reservations or raised expectations, but because Emily came home with a flyer for a food truck festival, and Rich looked up from the couch and said, That sounds good, with actual interest instead of reflexive agreement. The realization dawned on Emily halfway through the sentence where she was explaining where it was. Oh, she said, blinking. You're actually coming. I am, Rich replied. Unless you didn't mean it as an invitation. I didn't know I was, she said honestly. But I am. They paused, looking at each other, then laughed in the same startled way one does when discovering a door where there used to be a wall. The festival was noisy and crowded and smelled like too many spices competing for dominance. They walked slowly, shoulder to shoulder, commenting on menus and people watching without trying too hard. Felt unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just alert, like the first date jitters they hadn't felt in years, stripped of novelty but sharpened by history. At one booth, Rich ordered something aggressively spicy on purpose, then pretended not to regret it. Emily raised an eyebrow. "You okay there, hero?" He coughed once. "I have made choices." She laughed, unguarded and bright, and Rich felt the sound land somewhere warm and territorial in his chest. They shared food instead of ordering separately, negotiating bites and trades with mock seriousness. That, too, was familiar, but it tasted different now, like nostalgia updated for a new palate. "You don't feel like you have to entertain me?" Emily observed as they leaned against a railing, watching a band tune up. "I don't feel like I need to impress you," Rich replied. She smiled. "I like this version." "So do I," he said. "It's quieter, less performative." Emily nodded. "I didn't realize how much energy I was spending being interesting. And I didn't realize how much energy I was saving by being steady," he replied. "They're not opposites, but they do require calibration." She bumped his shoulder lightly. "Look at you, talking like a therapist." "Don't get used to it," Rich said. "I charge by the hour." Over the next few weeks, they relearned the rhythms that had gone slightly off-key without either of them noticing. They started walking after dinner, not long treks, just enough to reset their minds. Sometimes they talked about work. Sometimes they talked about nothing. Sometimes they talked about things they hadn't revisited in years. How they'd met, what scared them in their early 20s, the parts of themselves they'd assumed were done evolving. Emily confessed that she'd quietly mourned parts of her ambition, mistaking comfort for stagnation. Rich admitted that he equated predictability with safety, and safety with love, without asking if that equation still held. "I don't want chaos," he said one night as they strolled under streetlights. "But I don't want silence either." Emily linked her arm through his. "We can learn to tell the difference." They argued too, but differently. When Rich bristled at a withheld detail or a postponed conversation, he said so instead of filing it away. When Emily felt herself reaching for validation from someplace easier than honesty, she stopped and named the impulse out loud. It wasn't elegant, but it was transparent. One Saturday morning, Rich woke up and immediately knew something was off. Emily was moving around the kitchen with attention that didn't belong to the hour. Cabinets shut a bit too loudly. Coffee poured with aggressive precision. "What's wrong?" he asked gently, leaning against the doorframe. Emily hesitated, then sighed. "I'm supposed to meet my sister later, and I don't want to." He waited. "She knows about everything," Emily continued, "and she's not wrong when she calls me out. But I'm not looking for absolution or punishment. I'm trying to do better." Rich nodded. "Do you want support or distraction?" Emily smiled faintly. "Support, but gentle." He kissed her forehead. "Then I'll handle lunch afterward. Comfort carbs." She laughed, tension easing. "You're very good at this." He shrugged. "Low bar this morning." The comedy crept back in unexpectedly. Once, during a movie night, Emily accidentally blurted commentary during a dramatic scene Rich was invested in. He turned to her, mock offended. "I thought we talked about this," he said solemnly. "We talked about honesty," Emily said. "This monologue is unnecessary." He stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing so suddenly she jumped. "I missed this," he said when he could breathe again. "Talking over movies?" "No." Feeling like laughing is safe again. That truth mattered more than the joke. Therapy continued, not as crisis management anymore, but maintenance. Dr. Lewis noticed the shift immediately. "You're negotiating now," she observed during one session. "That's what couples do when they see each other as collaborators rather than threats." Emily glanced at Rich. "We're out of practice." "That's fine," the therapist said. "You don't have to be perfect. You have to be curious." Curious became their anchor. They asked questions instead of making assumptions, checked interpretations instead of building narratives. When uncertainty surfaced, they treated it like a shared puzzle rather than a private indictment. One evening, as they folded laundry together, Emily paused, underwear dangling awkwardly from her hand. "Do you think," she said cautiously, "we rushed into comfort?" Rich considered it. "I think we earned comfort. We just forgot that comfort still needs maintenance." She nodded. "I don't want to confuse being chosen with being automatic anymore." "You're not," he said. "Chosen means I wake up and decide, not assume." She smiled softly. "I like being decided on." He kissed her then. Not dramatic, not desperate, just present. It wasn't lost on Rich that trust didn't return all at once. Some days he felt completely at ease. Other days, a stray memory or sound tightened his chest without warning. But he stopped treating that as regression. Healing, he learned, wasn't linear. It was responsive. Emily didn't grow defensive when he needed reassurance. She didn't get tired of accountability. She didn't treat his caution as punishment. Instead, she treated it as part of the landscape they were rebuilding on, solid but weather-marked. One night, curled up in bed, Emily said quietly, "Thank you for staying." Rich turned to her. "Thank you for showing me I didn't have to threaten to be heard." They lay there in the dark, hands linked, breathing in sync. Not because they'd restored an old rhythm, but because they'd composed a new one together. Relearning each other hadn't been romantic in the cinematic sense, but it was intimate in the ways that counted. And for the first time since the rupture, neither of them felt like they were bracing for the next shoe to drop. They were moving forward, not because they owed it to the past, but because the present finally felt honest enough to build on. Chapter 7. The test case. Rich first suspected something was off when Emily started reorganizing the coat closet on a Saturday morning. She wasn't humming. She wasn't narrating her thoughts. She wasn't inviting commentary about why they owned 3 nearly identical scarves. She was quiet in a way that suggested decision, not distraction. "Everything okay?" Rich asked from the kitchen, where he was nursing his second cup of coffee and pretending not to watch. "Yes," Emily said, a little too evenly. Then, after a pause, "Actually, can I run something by you?" That phrasing caught his attention. Emily didn't ask permission to speak often. "Not anymore." He set his mug down. "Of course." She stepped into the doorway, hands tucked into the pockets of her hoodie. "HR called yesterday. They finished reviewing everything with Kevin." Rich didn't interrupt. He just nodded once. "He's been formally warned and reassigned. Different floor. No contact directive," Emily continued. "They asked if I wanted to add anything to the file. And?" Rich asked gently. "I said no," she replied, "because there isn't anything new. But I wanted you to hear it from me first." There it was. Not the content, but the order. "Thank you," Rich said. "How does that feel?" Emily considered. "Like closing a tab that's been draining my battery." He smiled despite himself. "That's accurate." She laughed softly, then exhaled. "There's more." He waited. While HR was talking, my phone buzzed. Emily met his eyes directly. "Unknown number." I didn't open it. I handed my phone to them and asked them to add it to the record. Rich felt something unclench. "Okay. I didn't want this to be another situation where I handled it fine but alone," she added. "I don't want you guessing." He crossed the room without thinking and pulled her into a brief, firm hug. It wasn't celebratory. It was grounding. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what I needed." Later that day, Rich found himself stuck in an unexpected spiral. Nothing had gone wrong. Everything had gone right. And yet his mind kept testing the perimeter, poking at memories like loose boards. Emily noticed when he grew quieter at dinner. "You're somewhere else," she said, not accusing. Observant. "I'm cataloging," Rich admitted. "Want help? Or do you want space?" He smiled. "Help." She nodded. "Then say it out loud." He leaned back. "Part of me keeps waiting for the other shoe. For the moment where I realize I relaxed too soon." Emily didn't bristle. "That makes sense. I don't want to live in vigilance," he continued. "I just don't want to be naive." "Those aren't the same thing," she said. "And you don't have to pretend this didn't hurt to prove you're past it." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You're not rushing me." "I'm pacing us," Emily replied. "Together." He reached for her hand across the table. "Then here's my inconvenient truth. I'm proud of how you handled this. And that scares me a little." She smiled softly. "Because pride makes you invest again." "Exactly." "Good," she said. "I'm investing too." The real test came unplanned on a Wednesday evening. They were at the grocery store. Aisles too narrow, music too cheerful, when Emily stiffened beside him. Kevin stood near the end of the frozen foods section, basket in hand, eyes locking onto hers. Rich felt it immediately, even before he saw him. The change in Emily's posture, the way her breathing shifted. Kevin started forward. Emily didn't move closer to Rich. She moved past him. "Hey," Kevin said, forcing an easy tone. "Thought you stopped shopping on this side of town." Emily leaned toward him just enough for her voice to carry without rising. "This interaction is documented as unwanted. Please don't approach me again." Kevin blinked, clearly unprepared. "I just wanted to say." Emily raised her hand, not angrily but final. "Stop." A few people nearby glanced over. Kevin flushed, pride warring with self-preservation. Rich watched, heart pounding, hands carefully relaxed at his sides. Not because he was passive, but because he was trusting. Kevin muttered something under his breath and turned away. Emily exhaled slowly, then walked back to Rich. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes. Are you?" He considered it, then smiled small, genuine. "I am." At the checkout line, Emily leaned into him, head resting under his chin like it always used to. But this time it wasn't reflex. It was choice. That night, lying in bed, Rich said into the dark, "I realized something today." Emily hummed acknowledgement. "I didn't need to step in," he said. "Not because I didn't care, but because I trusted you to handle it." She turned slightly, facing him. "That means a lot. It also means I'm not guarding the marriage alone anymore," he continued. "That part matters even more." Emily took his hand and pressed it to her chest. "You never were. But I didn't show up beside you like I should have." He shrugged gently. "You're here now." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was settled. Emily spoke then, carefully. "Can I ask you something without pressure?" "Always," Rich said. "Do you still want the life we talked about?" She asked. "Kids, plans, that future?" He didn't answer immediately, not because the answer was unclear, but because it deserved intention. Yes, he said finally. I just want it built on honesty, not assumption. She smiled into the dark. Me too. At their next therapy session, Dr. Lewis observed them closely as they recounted the grocery store encounter. You handled a rupture opportunity well, she said. That's not the same as pretending it didn't matter. Emily nodded. I didn't feel small afterward. I felt aligned. Rich added, I didn't feel sidelined. I felt included. Dr. Lewis smiled. That's the shift. Trust isn't about removing all risk. It's about knowing how your partner will respond when risk appears. As they left the office, Emily laced her fingers through Rich's. Still okay? She asked. He squeezed back. Yeah, I think that was the test. And we passed, he said. Not perfectly, but honestly. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. I'll take honest over perfect any day. Rich laughed softly. I married you for your ambition. I'm keeping you for your follow-through. She laughed too, lighter than she had in months. The future no longer felt hypothetical, felt earned. And for the first time since everything had fractured, Rich no longer felt like love was something he had to defend. It was something they were actively choosing together every ordinary day. Chapter 8. Forward. Together. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning, which felt appropriate. Sunny but not dramatic. Coffee still steaming. No deadlines pressing in from the edges of the day. They were sitting at the small table by the window, legs tucked up, the city moving at its usual pace outside. Rich had his laptop open, not working, just absently scrolling something he wasn't really reading. Emily was twisting her mug slowly, watching the surface of the coffee shift with each lazy turn. Can I ask you something? She said, casual but careful. Rich glanced up. You don't need permission. I know, she said. I just want to do this right. That earned her his full attention. He closed the laptop and pushed it aside. Okay. She took a breath. When we talked about the future before, all the vague someday stuff, we assumed it would unfold naturally. Comfortably. He nodded. Yeah. I don't want us to drift into it again, Emily continued. I want to choose it. Actively. Rich leaned back, studying her face. Not for tells, not for omissions, just presence. What does choosing it look like to you? I want us to talk about timing, about kids, about the life we keep referencing like it'll appear if we don't look directly at it. He smiled faintly. You're saying we should look directly at it? Yes, Emily said. Even if it means adjusting expectations. Even if it's inconvenient. That does seem to be on theme, Rich replied dryly. She laughed, some of the tension easing. I'm not rushing, she added quickly. I just don't want us to slide back into autopilot because things feel good again. Rich reached for her hand. They feel good because we're paying attention. Exactly, she said. I don't want that to stop. He squeezed her fingers. Then let's be specific. Emily blinked. Specific how? Well, he said thoughtful. We agreed years ago we didn't want to wait forever. And now we know that later isn't a plan. She smiled slowly. Are you suggesting a plan? I'm suggesting a conversation, Rich said. Which, historically, is step one. She laughed again, more freely this time. Okay, conversation accepted. They spent the next hour talking. Not drafting timelines or setting impossible markers, but clarifying intentions. What they were excited about. What scared them. What they wanted more of before adding someone new to their lives. Rich admitted he wanted to feel solid again before expanding the chaos. Emily acknowledged she wanted to prove to herself that consistency didn't equal complacency. Neither of those wants contradicted the idea of a family. They just needed to be voiced. That afternoon, they met Mark and his girlfriend for lunch. Mark eyed them over his menu. You two seem lighter. Rich smirked. We're emotionally evolved now. Emily kicked him under the table. Mark raised an eyebrow. Ah, so therapy's working. Emily grinned. Who knew talking would help? Revolutionary, Mark said solemnly. Throughout the meal, Rich noticed how Emily leaned into him when she laughed, how easily she caught his eyes across the table. Not possessive, not performative, present. Later, as they walked back to the car, Emily said quietly, I don't feel like I'm making up ground anymore. Rich nodded. Me neither. The house settled back into its rhythms, but with subtle differences. Phones still stayed off during dinner, but now there were check-ins instead of assumptions. A quick "are you okay?" offered without suspicion. A casual, I need you to hear this spoken without fear. Some nights they talked late into the evening. Other nights they coexisted comfortably in silence. Both felt earned now, not default. One night, as they folded laundry together, still their most domestic and surprisingly revealing ritual, Emily held up a tiny mismatched sock they'd accidentally brought home from a friend's place weeks earlier. She smiled at it thoughtfully. That doesn't feel hypothetical anymore. Rich watched her, surprised, not alarmed, just aware. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She met his eyes. Does that scare you? He considered the question honestly. It doesn't scare me like losing us did. Emily nodded. Same. Their final therapy session came sooner than Rich expected. Dr. Lewis leaned back in her chair, studying them with professional satisfaction. You're not here because things are broken anymore, she said. You're here because you want maintenance. Emily smiled. Preventative care. Rich added. Turns out ignoring warning lights is bad. Dr. Lewis chuckled. Indeed. Before we wrap, I want each of you to say one thing you're fully trusting your partner with now. Emily spoke first. My attention. I'm not renting it out anymore. Rich didn't hesitate. My security. I've stopped pretending it means I don't need reassurance. Dr. Lewis nodded once. That's a strong place to land. As they stood to leave, Emily reached for Rich's hand without thinking. He took it without hesitation. On a quiet evening weeks later, they sat on the back porch, watching the sky fade from gold to blue. Emily rested her head against Rich's shoulder, content. You know, she said, I used to think stability meant nothing big would ever change. And now? Rich asked. Now I think stability means knowing we'll deal with change together, she replied. He smiled down at her. That's much better. They stayed there as the first stars appeared, neither rushing to fill the quiet. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was intentional. And as the future stretched out in front of them, no longer abstract, no longer assumed, it felt less like a gamble and more like a promise they were both actively choosing to keep forward, together.